Sometimes the purest love comes from the most innocent hearts. When you lose everything that matters, you'll fight like hell to protect what little remains. That's exactly what happened to 12-year-old Clara Mae Cartwright in the Arizona desert of 1880. Her donkey Rufus was all she had left in this world. So when a deadly rattlesnake coiled to strike him, Clara didn't think twice. She threw herself between them. The townspeople expected to find her dead by morning. Instead, they found something impossible. Clara was alive, her arms wrapped around Rufus, the snake dead beside them. The doctor said the venom should have killed her, but she lived. And she was different somehow, changed. Some say an Apache spirit saved her. Others believe it was her dead mother's ghost. But what really happened when this brave little girl faced death to save her best friend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet kissed the rim of the eastern mesa when Clara Mae Cartwright stepped out of their one-room cabin, her bare feet finding purchase on the weathered wooden planks that served as their front porch. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sage and dust, with just a hint of the coming heat that would make the Arizona territory feel like the devil's own furnace by midday. She pulled her mother's wooden cross necklace from beneath her patched cotton dress, running her small fingers over the smooth surface her father had carved 3 summers past, when the fever took Martha Cartwright and left them to fend for themselves in this unforgiving land. "Morning, Rufus," she whispered to the gray donkey standing patient as stone beside their tiny corral. The animal's ears twitched forward at the sound of her voice, and those dark, intelligent eyes seemed to hold more understanding than most folks gave a beast credit for. Rufus had been her constant companion since her mother's passing, carrying water from the distant spring, hauling supplies from town, and bearing the weight of their modest possessions when they'd moved from place to place, searching for ground that might yield enough to keep body and soul together. The worn leather saddle draped across the corral fence told the story of their partnership, cracked and mended in a dozen places, darkened by sweat and weather, but still sturdy enough for the work that needed doing. Clara had learned to read the moods and needs of this stubborn, loyal creature better than she could read the few books her mother had left behind. When Rufus flicked his tail 3 times and stamped his left hoof, rain was coming. When he refused to move forward on a trail, something dangerous lay ahead. And when he nuzzled her shoulder with his velvet nose, as he did now, it meant he understood her sadness and was offering what comfort a donkey could give. "Clara Mae, you best get that fire started if we're going to eat anything resembling breakfast." This morning, her father's voice drifted through the cabin's single window, rough with sleep and the weight of another day's survival pressing down on his shoulders. Jeremiah Cartwright had aged 10 years in the 3 since his wife died, his once broad shoulders now carrying a permanent hunch, as if the sky itself had grown too heavy for him to bear upright. She gathered kindling from their meager woodpile, arranged it in the stone fire ring with the practiced efficiency of a child who'd learned to manage such things before her 10th birthday. The match flared bright in the pre-dawn darkness, catching the dry mesquite and sending thin tendrils of smoke curling upward toward the stars that were just beginning to fade. By the time her father emerged from the cabin, squinting against the growing light and running weathered hands through his graying hair, she had coffee brewing in their dented tin pot and cornmeal mush bubbling in the cast-iron pan that had belonged to her grandmother back in Missouri. "You're a treasure, little girl," he said, settling onto the tree stump that served as his favorite chair. His voice carried the soft drawl of a man who'd been born further east, but had spent enough years in the territories to let the desert change his speech patterns. "Don't know what I'd do without you looking after things." Clara smiled up at him, ladling the simple breakfast into 2 chipped bowls. She'd heard these same words nearly every morning for 3 years, but they still warmed her heart like sunshine after a long winter. Her father was a good man. Everyone in Dead Rock agreed. on that much, but life had worn him down to the bone. The small homestead they'd carved out of the desert produced barely enough to keep them fed, and the few head of cattle they'd managed to accumulate had a troubling tendency to wander off, or fall victim to the coyotes that sang their haunting songs from the surrounding hills each night. Dead Rock itself wasn't much to speak of, a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings clustered around a single dirt street, like a handful of dice thrown down by a careless gambler. The town had earned its name from the massive boulder that sat at the center of what passed for a main square, a chunk of red sandstone that some long-ago traveler had declared looked like a tombstone. The name had stuck, despite the fact that the rock bore no resemblance to any grave marker Clara had ever seen. It was simply there, immovable and eternal, much like the people who'd chosen to make their lives in its shadow. Henley's office occupied one end of the main street, its painted sign faded to near illegibility but still hanging stubbornly from its chains. The good doctor had arrived in Dead Rock some 15 years past, carrying little more than a medical bag and a reputation for discretion that made him valuable to folks who preferred not to answer too many questions about their past. He was a small meat man with kind eyes and gentle hands, the sort who could set a broken bone or deliver a baby with equal skill, though he was quick to admit that his formal medical training had ended somewhere around the time he'd decided that the civilized world held no place for him. Sheriff Morrison kept the peace, such as it was, from a small office next to the general store. He'd been elected to the position mainly because he was the only man in town who owned a badge, having purchased it from a traveling merchant who claimed it had belonged to a genuine lawman up in Colorado territory. Whether this was true or not, Morrison wore the star with a pride that made questioning its authenticity seem ungracious. He was fair in his judgments and steady with his gun, which was about all anyone could ask of frontier justice. Mrs. Abernathy ran the general store with the iron efficiency of a woman who'd learned to stretch every penny until it screamed for mercy. She'd arrived in Dead Rock as a young bride, only to lose her husband to consumption within their first year of marriage. Rather than return to whatever family she'd left behind, she'd taken over the store and made it the beating heart of their small community. Her shelves held everything from flour and coffee to ammunition and patent medicines, and her ledger books contained the financial history of every family within 50 miles. She extended credit when times were hard and collected debts when times were good, maintaining the delicate balance that kept their fragile economy functioning. These were the people who made up Clara's world, hard-working, weather-beaten souls, who'd found their way to this remote corner of the territory for reasons they rarely discussed. Some were running from the law, others from broken hearts or failed dreams. A few, like her father, had simply kept moving west until there was nowhere left to go. What united them was the understanding that survival in this harsh land required cooperation, and that asking too many questions about a neighbor's past was a luxury none of them could afford. Clara had grown up among these people, learning their stories and their silences with equal attention. She knew that Doc Henley's hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking, and that he kept a bottle of whiskey hidden behind his medical supplies for the nights when old memories pressed too close. She knew that Sheriff Morrison wrote letters he never sent to someone named Margaret back in Kansas, and that Mrs. Abernathy still wore her wedding ring despite 15 years of widowhood. Children see things that adults work hard to hide, and Clara had learned to read the subtle signs of sorrow and hope that marked every face in Dead Rock. But it was with Rufus that she felt most at home, most herself. The donkey seemed to understand her in ways that even her beloved father could not. When sadness overwhelmed her, usually on the anniversary of her mother's death or during the long, cold nights when the wind howled through the gaps in their cabin walls, Rufus would rest his great head against her shoulder and simply wait with her until the pain passed. When excitement bubbled up inside her chest, usually sparked by the sight of wildflowers blooming after a rare desert rainstorm, or the discovery of a roadrunner's nest hidden among the cacti. Rufus would prick his ears forward and seem to share in her joy. "We'd best get moving if we're going to beat the heat," her father said, scraping the last of the cornmeal from his bowl. "That spring's been running lower each week, and I don't want to risk waiting until afternoon to fill our barrels." Clara nodded, though something deep in her chest fluttered with an uneasiness she couldn't name. The morning felt different somehow, charged with a tension that made the hair on her arms stand up despite the growing warmth of the desert air. She'd learned to trust these feelings over the years, though she'd never tried to explain them to anyone. How could she tell her father that sometimes she simply knew things, that rain was coming hours before the first clouds appeared, or that the old cow was about to calve, or that a visitor was approaching their homestead long before any dust cloud appeared on the horizon? These moments of knowing came to her like whispers on the wind, too soft to be properly heard, but too insistent to be ignored. Her mother had possessed similar intuitions, she remembered, often sensing trouble or opportunity before it became apparent to others. Martha Cartwright had called it listening to the world, and had gently encouraged Clara to pay attention to the small voice that sometimes spoke up inside her heart. "The land has its own language," her mother had said during one of their long walks among the sagebrush and prickly pear. "Most folks are too busy talking to hear it, but if you learn to be still and really listen, it will tell you what you need to know." Now, as Clara helped her father load the empty water barrels onto Rufus's patient back, that inner voice was speaking again, though she couldn't quite make out what it was trying to tell her. The sensation was like trying to remember a dream. After waking, the harder she reached for it, the more quickly it slipped away. All she could capture was a sense of importance, a feeling that this particular journey to the spring would be different from all the others. Rufus shifted beneath the weight of the barrels, his hooves finding steady purchase on the rocky ground. As they set out from the homestead, the sun climbed steadily higher, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that took Clara's breath away despite their familiarity. This was a world harsh and beautiful, unforgiving yet somehow magical in its vastness. She'd never known any other life, never wanted any other life, though she sometimes wondered what it would be like to live in one of the big cities her mother had described, with their crowded streets and tall buildings that blocked out the sky. The trail to the spring wound through a maze of red rock formations and scattered pinyon pines, following the ancient path carved by countless generations of wildlife and the occasional human traveler. Clara knew every twist and turn by heart, could have walked it blindfolded if necessary. But today, each familiar landmark seemed to pulse with significance, as if the very stones were trying to tell her something important. The spring lay nestled in a natural bowl of red sandstone, fed by an underground stream that had carved its way through the desert rock for countless centuries. Twisted cottonwood trees provided blessed shade around the water's edge, their leaves whispering secrets in the morning breeze. Clara had always loved this place, with its sense of ancient peace and the way sunlight danced on the surface of the clear, cold water. It was one of the few spots in their harsh world that felt truly alive, truly welcoming. But today, as they approached the familiar clearing, every instinct in Clara's body screamed danger. Rufus felt it too. The donkey's ears swiveled forward, then flattened against his skull as he came to an abrupt halt 20 yards from the spring. His nostrils flared wide, testing the air for scents that Clara's human nose couldn't detect. A low rumble vibrated through his chest, not quite a bray, but something deeper, more primal. "What's got into you, old boy?" Jeremiah asked, giving the lead rope a gentle tug. But Rufus planted his hooves and refused to budge, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the cottonwoods. Clara slipped down from her perch atop the water barrels, her bare feet touching the sun-warmed stone with practiced silence. The strange, Inner voice that had whispered warnings all morning now spoke with crystal clarity, though not in words her mind could grasp. Instead, it painted pictures across her consciousness, images of coiled death, of striking fangs, of poison flowing through veins like liquid fire. "Pa," she whispered, reaching for his weathered hand. "Something's wrong." Jeremiah Cartwright had learned to trust his daughter's intuitions over the years, though he'd never fully understood them. He pulled the old Colt revolver from his holster, checking the cylinder with movements made automatic by years of frontier living. The gun had belonged to Martha's father, and it had kept them safe through more than one dangerous encounter with both man and beast. "Stay behind me, little girl," he murmured, easing forward through the scattered rocks and stunted sagebrush. But Clara's attention was drawn elsewhere. Near the base of the largest cottonwood, partially hidden in the dappled shadows, something moved with the fluid grace of flowing water. At first glance, it might have been a fallen branch, thick and mottled brown. The branches didn't pulse with that hypnotic rhythm, and they certainly didn't end in triangular heads, equipped with heat-sensing pits and fangs loaded with venom. The diamondback rattlesnake was easily 6 feet long and thick as a man's forearm, its scales catching fragments of sunlight that filtered through the cottonwood leaves. The distinctive pattern of diamonds along its back seemed to shift and blur as the serpent moved, creating an almost mesmerizing effect that could freeze prey in place until it was too late to escape. This was an old snake. Clara realized a patriarch of its kind that had survived decades in this hostile environment by being smarter, faster, and more deadly than anything else that shared its territory. And it was coiled directly beside the spring, blocking access to the precious water they desperately needed. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Jeremiah breathed, raising his pistol with hands that showed only the slightest tremor. "That's the biggest rattler I've ever seen." The snake's tail rose slightly, producing a sound like dried beans shaking in a gourd. The rattling grew louder, more insistent, as the creature sensed their presence and prepared to defend its territory. Its wedge-shaped head swayed gently from side to side, those unblinking eyes scanning for targets, that forked tongue tasting the air for chemical signatures of threat or opportunity. Clara found herself taking a step forward, then another, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name or control. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings, but something deeper, something that felt like her mother's voice whispering from beyond the grave, urged her onward. "Clara Mae, get back here right now." Her father's command cracked like a whip, but her feet continued moving of their own accord. The snake's attention shifted to her, that prehistoric gaze focusing with laser intensity on the small girl approaching its domain. The rattling intensified, becoming a continuous buzzing that seemed to fill the entire clearing. This was nature's final warning, the last chance for retreat before the violence began. Rufus broke free from the lead rope, his powerful muscles bunching as he charged past Jeremiah toward the spring. The donkey's protective instincts had finally overcome his caution, and he was determined to place himself between Clara and the deadly serpent. His hooves struck sparks from the stone as he skidded to a halt just yards from the coiled rattlesnake, his body forming a living barrier between the child and certain death. The snake struck with lightning speed, its head snapping forward like a released spring, but instead of finding Clara's small body, its fangs sank deep into Rufus's shoulder. The donkey screamed a sound Clara had never heard before, high and piercing and filled with agony that seemed to echo off the surrounding canyon walls. "No." The word tore from Clara's throat as she threw herself forward, her small hands grabbing for the thick body of the snake, even as it prepared to strike again. She felt the powerful muscles writhing beneath her fingers, felt the alien coldness of scales designed by millions of years of evolution to deliver death with perfect efficiency. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching into eternity. She could see her father's face, twisted with horror and desperation as he tried to get a clear shot without risking her life. She could feel Rufus's body trembling against her legs, poison already beginning its deadly work in his bloodstream. And she could sense the snake's confusion as it tried to process this unprecedented situation. Prey that fought back instead of fleeing, hands that grasped instead of withdrawing. The second strike came faster than human reflexes could follow, the serpent's head whipping around with mechanical precision. Clara felt the impact like a punch to her chest, felt twin points of fire as fangs, longer than rose thorns, pierced the thin fabric of her dress and found the tender skin beneath. The venom followed immediately, a burning sensation that spread outward from the wound like molten metal, flowing through her veins. But something impossible happened in that moment of contact between predator and prey. Instead of the overwhelming terror she should have felt, Clara experienced a strange sense of completeness, as if some missing piece of herself had finally clicked into place. The snake's ancient consciousness brushed against her own, and for one crystalline instant, she understood things that no 12-year-old child should have been able to comprehend. She saw the serpent's perspective, the endless search for warmth and food, the simple imperative to survive in a world full of larger, more aggressive creatures. She felt its confusion at being challenged by something so small and seemingly helpless, its instinctive response to defend territory that meant the difference between life and death in this harsh environment. And beneath all of that, she sensed something else, a recognition, as if the snake knew her from somewhere beyond the boundaries of the physical world. The rattlesnake released its grip and fell back, its body going suddenly limp. Not dead, Clara realized with that same impossible knowing, but somehow drained, emptied of the vital force that had made it such a formidable predator. The creature's eyes had lost their fierce intensity, becoming dull and unfocused as it slithered away into the rocks with movements that seemed almost mechanical. Clara collapsed beside Rufus, her arms wrapping around the donkey's neck as waves of dizziness crashed over her. She could feel the venom working its way through her system, but alongside the poison came something else, a warmth that seemed to originate from the wooden cross hanging around her neck, spreading outward through her body like golden honey. "Clara! Clara Mae!" Her father's voice sounded as if it were coming from a great distance, though she could see him kneeling beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her small form. His face had gone pale as parchment, and tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Stay with me, little girl. Just stay with me." But Clara was already drifting away, carried along by currents she couldn't resist toward a place that felt like coming home. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of gentle hands that felt exactly like her, mother's lifting her up and carrying her toward a light that held no heat but promised infinite warmth. Jeremy found them hours later as the sun reached its zenith, when the heat had become unbearable and his own desperate search had finally led him back to the spring. Clara lay motionless beside Rufus, her small arms still wrapped around the donkey's neck in a protective embrace that death itself seemed reluctant to break. The snake was nowhere to be seen, though its shed skin lay nearby like evidence of some impossible transformation. Doc Henley had delivered his share of impossible diagnoses over the years, had witnessed recoveries that defied medical explanation and survival stories that would have seemed like tall tales if he hadn't documented them himself. But nothing in his 15 years of frontier medicine had prepared him for the case of Clara Mae Cartwright. The girl should have been dead. By every law of biology and toxicology that he understood, the amount of venom that massive diamondback had injected should have killed a grown man, let alone a 12-year-old child who couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds soaking wet. Yet here she lay in his clinic's single bed, breathing steadily, her pulse strong and regular, her skin warm to the touch despite the deadly poison that should have been freezing her blood. He opened his medical journal, a leather-bound volume filled with careful observations and detailed sketches that represented the accumulated knowledge of his frontier practice, and began to write. The pen felt heavy in his fingers, weighted down by the impossibility of what he was trying to record. Patient, Clara Mae Cartwright, female, approximately 12 years of age. Brought in by father following apparent envenomation by a large diamondback rattlesnake. Physical examination reveals puncture wounds consistent with snakebite, but no other symptoms of systemic poisoning. Patient remains unconscious but stable. Vital signs normal. This contradicts everything I know about rattlesnake venom effects. He set down the pen and rubbed his tired eyes. Through the clinic's single window, he could see Jeremiah Cartwright sitting on the wooden bench outside, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and worry. The man hadn't left his post since carrying his daughter into town 3 days ago. Hadn't eaten more than the bread and water that Mrs. Abernathy forced on him. Hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone. The door creaked open, admitting Sheriff Morrison along with a gust of desert air that stirred the medical charts pinned to the wall. The lawman removed his hat and approached the bedside with the careful reverence most folks reserve for churches and graveyards. "How is she, Doc?" Henley shook his head slowly, his gaze returning to Clara's peaceful face. "I don't rightly know how to answer that, Tom. She should be dead, plain and simple. That much venom would have dropped a horse. But look at her breathing easy, color good, heartbeat steady as a church bell. Maybe it wasn't as bad a bite as Jeremiah thought. Heat of the moment, fear making things seem worse than they were. I've seen the puncture wounds. Deep, clean, exactly what you'd expect from a big diamondback. And there's something else." Doc Henley rolled up the sleeve of Clara's nightgown, revealing the bite site, where there should have been swelling, discoloration, and tissue death. The skin showed only 2 small marks that were already beginning to fade. Never seen anything heal this fast. It's like her body is fighting off the venom somehow. Sheriff Morrison studied the girl's face, noting the serene expression that seemed almost otherworldly. "Folks in town are starting to talk, Doc. You know how stories spread in a place like Dead Rock. What kind of talk? The kind that starts with whispers and ends with either sainthood or witch-burning, depending on which way the wind blows." Morrison settled into the wooden chair beside the bed, his weathered hands turning his hat brim in slow circles. "Mrs. Abernathy swears she saw a light around Clara when Jeremiah brought her in, not lamplight or sunlight, but something different. Something that seemed to come from the girl herself." Doc Henley had heard stranger things during his years on the frontier. The desert did things to people, showed them sights and possibilities that the civilized world refused to acknowledge. He'd learned to keep an open mind about such matters, though his medical training still insisted on logical explanations for everything he observed. Light or no light, the girl is alive when she should be dead. That's fact enough for me. The clinic door opened again, this time admitting a figure that made both men straighten with surprise. Joseph Crowfeather rarely entered the white buildings of Dead Rock, preferring to conduct his trading business in the open air of the main street. But now the Apache elder stood in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that made the room feel charged with electricity. "Joseph," Sheriff Morrison nodded respectfully. The old Apache had lived peacefully in the area for decades, serving as an unofficial bridge between his people and the white settlers. His word carried weight with both communities, and his presence in the clinic was bound to fuel even more speculation. Crowfeather approached the bed with silent steps, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. He studied Clara for a long moment, then reached into the leather pouch that hung from his belt. His fingers emerged holding a small object, a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a bird, polished smooth by countless years of handling. "This belonged to my wife," he said quietly, his English carefully pronounced despite the accent that marked him as a man who had learned the language as an adult. She made it for a white woman who showed kindness to our people during the fever time, a woman named Martha. Doc Henley felt something cold settle in his stomach. Martha Cartwright? The Apache elder nodded slowly. This child carries the same spirit, the same protection. He placed the turquoise bird on the small table beside Clara's bed, where it seemed to catch and hold the lamplight. The snake knew. That is why it released her. Now hold on just a minute, Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. You're talking about spirits and protection like it's scientific fact. Your science, Crowfeather replied with gentle dignity, does not explain why this child lives. My grandmother's grandmother told stories of such things. Sometimes when great kindness is shown, great protection is given in return. The debt passes from mother to daughter, from generation to generation. Doc Henley found himself studying Clara with new eyes, noting details he'd missed before. The way her breathing seemed to synchronize with some rhythm beyond the merely physical. The unusual warmth that radiated from her skin despite the coolness of the clinic. The sense of presence that filled the room, as if invisible watchers stood guard around her bed. You're saying Martha Cartwright did something that earned your people's protection for her daughter? More than earned, Crowfeather corrected. She saved the lives of 7 children during the spotted fever outbreak 5 years ago. Came to our camp when your own people would not. Brought medicine and knowledge. 3 of those children are now grown, with children of their own. Such kindness creates ripples that spread far beyond what the eye can see. The old Apache moved toward the door, then paused to look back at Clara one more time. She will wake soon. When she does, she will be changed. The crossing between worlds leaves its mark on those who return. After Crowfeather left, silence settled over the clinic like dust after a windstorm. Doc Henley returned to his journal, but found himself unable to write. How could he document conversations about spirits and protection and debts that passed between generations? How could he explain to any medical colleague that he was beginning to believe such things might be true? Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of dead rock going about its daily business. Mrs. Abernathy sweeping her porch. Sheriff Morrison talking to someone about a missing cow. The distant lowing of cattle being driven to water. Life continuing in its familiar patterns while something extraordinary unfolded in his modest clinic. Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring words too soft to understand. But Doc Henley could have sworn he heard 2 voices, the child's own and something else. Something that sounded like a woman's gentle laughter carried on a wind that touched nothing else in the room. Clara woke on the 4th morning to the sound of mourning doves calling from the cottonwood outside Doc Henley's clinic window. The world seemed sharper somehow, as if someone had cleaned the dust from her eyes and allowed her to see colors that had always been there but never quite visible before. The wooden cross around her neck felt warm against her skin, pulsing with a gentle rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Pa? Her voice came out as barely a whisper, but it was enough to bring Jeremiah scrambling from his bedside vigil, his weathered face lighting up with relief and joy. Right here, little girl, right here. He gathered her into his arms with infinite gentleness, as if she might dissolve like morning mist if he held her too tightly. How do you feel? Clara considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her small body with the careful attention of someone who had recently become reacquainted with the concept of being alive. Different, she said finally. Like I can hear things I couldn't hear before. Even as she spoke, she became aware of the mouse family living in the clinic walls, their tiny hearts beating rapid percussion against her consciousness. She could sense Doc Henley in his back room, mixing medicines with hands that shook slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. And beyond the building, the entire town of Dead Rock seemed to pulse with life, human and animal heartbeats, creating a complex symphony that she'd never noticed before Doc Henley appeared in the doorway. his medical bag in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "Well now, Miss Cartwright, you've given us quite a scare. Mind if I take a look at you?" The examination was brief but thorough. Clara submitted to the poking and prodding with patient grace, though she found herself knowing the results before Doc Henley announced them. Her temperature was normal. Her pupils responded properly to light. The snake bite had healed completely, leaving only faint marks that would disappear entirely within days. "I don't understand it," the doctor muttered, more to himself than to his patient. "By all rights, you should be dead. Or at minimum, you should be suffering from tissue damage, nerve problems, breathing difficulties. Instead, you appeared to be in perfect health." "Better than perfect," Clara said quietly, then immediately wished she hadn't spoken. How could she explain that she felt more alive now than she ever had before? That every breath seemed to bring new awareness. Every heartbeat opened doors to understanding she couldn't have imagined. The day passed in a blur of visitors and questions. Mrs. Abernathy brought fresh bread and worried clucking sounds. Sheriff Morrison stopped by to take what he called an official statement, though Clara sensed he was more curious than official. Father McKenna, the circuit preacher who served Dead Rock when his travels brought him through, arrived with Bible verses and barely concealed excitement at what he was already calling a miracle. But it was Joseph Crowfeather who truly understood what had happened to her. The Apache elder arrived as the sun was setting, painting the clinic walls gold and orange. He entered without knocking, moving with the silent grace of a man who had learned to walk between worlds. His dark eyes studied Clara with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow felt like coming home. "You have been far away," he said simply, settling into the chair beside her bed. "What did you see?" Clara glanced at her father, unsure how much she should say. But Jeremiah nodded encouragingly, his own curiosity evident despite his worry. I saw my mother," Clara said softly. She was standing in a place that was bright but not bright, warm but not warm. There were others with her people I didn't recognize, but who seemed to know me. They were all watching, waiting. Waiting for what? For me to choose, whether to go with them or come back. Clara's fingers found the wooden cross at her throat, remembering the moment when her mother had pointed to it and smiled. Mama said the choice was mine, but that I had work to do if I stayed. Important work. Joseph Crowfeather reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small leather bag, no bigger than Clara's fist. The leather was old and soft, darkened by years of handling, and decorated with beadwork in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. "This belonged to my wife, Gentle Rain. She was a medicine woman among our people, one who could speak with the spirits and heal with her touch. Before she died, she told me to keep this safe, that someday it would find its way to the right person." He placed the pouch in Clara's small hands, and the moment her fingers touched the ancient leather, she gasped. Images flooded her mind. Young Apache woman gathering herbs by moonlight, hands glowing with soft radiance as they moved over the sick and injured. Ceremonies conducted in hidden canyons where the spirits still walked openly among the living. "She saw you in her dreams," Joseph continued. "A white child with the old gift, one who would bridge the gap between our peoples. She said you would need these tools when your time came." Clara opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside, she found an assortment of small objects, stones worn smooth by countless hands, dried herbs that still held their healing potency after years of storage, a piece of crystal that seemed to hold captured starlight, and a single eagle feather that felt alive with power. "I don't understand," she whispered, though part of her did understand, had always understood on some level that went deeper than conscious thought. "Your mother saved 7 of our children during the spotted fever time," Joseph explained. "She came to our camp when others would not, risked her own life to tend the sick. In our tradition, such kindness creates a debt that must be repaid. When the snake struck you, that debt was called in. The spirits of those children, now grown and with families of their own, stood between you and death. Jeremiah cleared his throat uncomfortably. Joseph, I appreciate what you're trying to tell us, but Clara's just a little girl. She can't be expected to carry the weight of some spiritual debt or mystical calling. The Apache elder smiled sadly. The calling chooses. Yes, my friend. We do not choose it, and children often carry such gifts more easily than adults, whose minds have grown rigid with disbelief. Clara felt the truth of his words resonating in her bones. The medicine pouch seemed to pulse with warmth in her hands, and she could sense the accumulated wisdom of generations flowing through the ancient objects. This wasn't something she could run from or deny. It was as much a part of her now as her heartbeat or her breathing. What am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice small but steady. Learn, Joseph replied. Listen. Help when you can, but do not try to force the gift. It will show you the way when the time is right. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Your mother's kindness planted seeds that are just beginning to grow. You are one of those seeds, Clara Mae. What you become will depend on how well you tend the garden of your spirit. After he left, father and daughter sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the clinic windows. Clara could feel new awareness settling into her consciousness, like sediment after a flood, strange and unsettling, but somehow right. She was the same girl who had awakened that morning, yet she was also someone entirely new. Pa, she said finally, are you afraid of me? Jeremiah considered the question with the careful honesty he'd always shown her. A little, he admitted, but not because of who you are. I'm afraid because I don't know how to protect you from what might come next. The world isn't always kind to people who are different. Clara nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. She could already sense the mixed reactions her survival had generated in Dead Rock: wonder and gratitude from some, suspicion and fear from others. People would be watching her now, looking for signs of strangeness, waiting to see if her miraculous recovery was the beginning or the end of unusual events. I'll be careful, she promised. But I don't think I can pretend to be the same person I was before. I wouldn't ask you to, Jeremiah said, kissing the top of her head. Your mother always said you were destined for something special. I reckon she was right. Outside, the night sounds of the desert began their ancient chorus: coyotes calling from distant hills, owls hunting in the darkness, the rustle of small creatures moving through the sage. But Clara heard something else now, a deeper rhythm that seemed to connect all living things in an intricate web of purpose and meaning. She was beginning to understand that her survival was not the end of her story, but rather the first chapter of something much larger. The knowledge both thrilled and terrified her, but she faced it with the same courage that had driven her to protect Rufus from the snake. Whatever came next, she would meet it as her mother's daughter, with an open heart and steady hands, ready to serve the mysterious forces that had given her this second chance at life. 3 weeks after Clara's miraculous recovery, she made a discovery that would change her understanding of her family's history forever. She was helping her father repair a section of their cabin wall where the winter winds had loosened several boards when her newly heightened senses detected something unusual behind the weathered wood. Pa, there's something back here, she said, running her small fingers along a crack that seemed too straight, too deliberate to be natural. Jeremiah set down his hammer and examined the spot Clara had found. Well, I'll be, he muttered, working his fingers into the gap until he could pry away a carefully concealed panel. Behind it lay a small cavity, and within that space, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather-bound journal. Clara's breath caught as she recognized the careful handwriting. On the cover, Martha Elizabeth Cartwright, Personal Observations and Thoughts. Her mother's journal, hidden away like a precious secret. "I never knew she kept a journal," Jeremiah said softly, his weathered hands gentle as he unwrapped the volume. "She must have hidden it before she died, during those final weeks when the fever was taking her." They sat together on their small porch as Clara opened the journal with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with her mother's graceful script, documenting not just daily events but deeper reflections on life in the territory, observations about the people around them, and most surprisingly, detailed accounts of encounters with the Apache families who lived in the surrounding areas. March 15, 1877. Clara read aloud. "Joseph Crowfeather brought his nephew to see me today. The boy had broken his arm badly, and their own healer was away visiting relatives. I set the bone and splinted it as best I could, then sent them home with willow bark tea for the pain. Joseph tried to pay me with a silver bracelet, beautiful work, but I could not accept it. These people have so little, and kindness should never require payment." Page after page revealed Martha Cartwright's secret humanitarian work. She had delivered babies in Apache camps when their own midwives were unavailable. She had shared precious medicines during disease outbreaks, often putting her own family's supplies at risk. She had taught Apache women how to prepare certain remedies using plants that grew only in white settlements, while learning traditional healing methods in return. April 2, 1878, Clara continued reading. "Little Dove's fever broke last night. Thank the Lord. I was so afraid we might lose her, as we lost the Henderson baby last month. Gentle Rain says there are spirits that watch over children who have been touched by true kindness. I don't pretend to understand their beliefs, but I've seen enough unexplained recoveries to wonder if they might be right." Jeremiah listened in amazement as the journal revealed aspects of his wife's life that she had kept carefully hidden. Not from shame, Clara realized, but from caution. The tensions between white settlers and Apache peoples ran deep in the territory, and Martha's work could have been seen as treason by some, charity by others, or simply foolish danger by most. But the most startling entries came near the end of the journal, written during Martha's final illness. June 10, 1879. Clara read, her voice growing quiet. "The fever grows worse each day, and I fear I will not see another summer." Clara Mae shows signs of the gift that Gentle Rain spoke of, the ability to sense things beyond ordinary perception. "Yesterday, she told me that the spotted mare was going to foal early, and sure enough, we found a new colt this morning. I pray that if something happens to me, the protection I have tried to earn for my family will extend to my daughter. She will need guidance that I may not live to provide." Clara's hand shook as she turned to the final entry. June 18, 1879. "I can barely hold the pen now, but this must be recorded. Gentle Rain came to see me yesterday, though she is forbidden to enter white settlements. She brought a medicine pouch that belonged to her grandmother's grandmother, a woman who could speak with spirits and heal with her touch. Gentle Rain says the pouch has been waiting for the right person, and she believes that person is Clara Mae. I have hidden it with this journal, along with a letter explaining what I can of our family's connection to Joseph's people. If my daughter ever needs to understand who she truly is, the answers are here." With trembling fingers, Clara searched the hidden cavity and found a second, smaller package. Inside was the medicine pouch that Joseph Crowfeather had given her, the very same one she had thought belonged to his wife. But now she understood the deeper truth. It had been waiting for her, passed from one medicine woman to another across generations until it found its way to the white child who would bridge two worlds. "Your mother," Jeremiah said slowly, "was a braver woman than I ever knew." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling around her shoulders like a cloak. Her mother's kindness had indeed created ripples that spread far beyond what the eye could see, and she was the living embodiment of those ripples. The debt that had saved her life was not just owed by the Apache families, Martha had helped. It was a cosmic balance that demanded she continue the work her mother had begun. Over the following days, Clara found herself testing the limits of her newfound abilities. She could sense when storms were approaching hours before clouds appeared on the horizon. She knew when the neighbor's cow was ready to calve, when coyotes were stalking the chickens, when travelers were approaching the settlement. Most remarkably, she seemed to be able to communicate with animals in ways that went beyond normal understanding. Rufus, completely recovered from his encounter with the snake, had become her closest confidant. The old donkey seemed to understand her thoughts and feelings with perfect clarity, often responding to unspoken requests or offering comfort when she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of her calling. "He knows what happened to us at the spring," Clara told her father one evening as they watched Rufus graze peacefully in their small corral. "He knows we're both different now." Different how? Clara struggled to find words for experiences that existed beyond language, connected to something bigger. Like we're part of a story that started long before we were born and will continue long after we're gone. She was learning to be careful about displaying her abilities in town. While most of Dead Rock's residents viewed her recovery as miraculous, there were some who watched her with suspicious eyes, muttering about unnatural things and the dangers of trafficking with savages. Clara understood instinctively that fear could be more dangerous than any rattlesnake, and that her gift would be most effective when used quietly, without fanfare or attention. But she could not resist helping when opportunities arose. When Mrs. Patterson's youngest boy went missing during a dust storm, Clara was able to guide the search party directly to the cave where he had taken shelter. When old Henry Mason's prize bull wandered off, she knew exactly which canyon to search. When the Henderson family's well ran dry, she somehow sensed that water could be found just 20 feet to the east. Each successful prediction, each helpful insight, added to her growing reputation as someone touched by forces beyond ordinary understanding. And with that reputation came both blessing and burden, the gratitude of those she helped, but also the weight of expectations and the constant awareness that she was being watched, tested, measured against standards she was only beginning to comprehend. The sacred eagle feather came to Clara on a morning when the desert air shimmered with unseasonable heat and the sky bore the copper tinge that meant sandstorms were brewing in the distant mountains. She was helping her father mend fence posts when Joseph Crowfeather appeared at their homestead, moving with the silent grace that always made it seem as if he had materialized from the desert itself. "Clara Mae," he said, his weathered face grave with purpose. "It is time for you to understand what you carry." Jeremiah looked up from his work, tension creeping into his shoulders. "Joseph, I appreciate what you've done for my daughter, but she's still just a child." "Whatever you're thinking. A child, yes," the Apache elder replied gently, "but not just a child. Not anymore." His dark eyes found Clara's, and she felt the familiar sensation of being truly seen, understood in ways that went beyond words. "The spirits have been patient, allowing you time to grow into your gift. But patience has its limits, and there are signs that trouble is coming." Clara set down the post-hole digger and wiped dust from her hands, her newly awakened senses already picking up the undercurrents of tension that seemed to flow around Joseph like invisible rivers. "What kind of trouble?" Instead of answering directly, Joseph reached into his medicine bundle and withdrew an object that made Clara's breath catch. The eagle feather was magnificent, nearly a foot long, with bands of brown and white that seemed to shift and flow in the morning light. But it was more than just beautiful. Clara could feel the power radiating from it like heat from a forge. "This feather belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, a war chief named Standing Bear, who could speak with the thunder beings and call rain from empty skies. It has been passed down through generations of medicine keepers waiting for one worthy to carry it." Joseph held the feather out to Clara, his expression solemn. "The spirits say that time has come. Clara hesitated, understanding instinctively that accepting the feather would change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But as her fingers closed around the quill, she felt a surge of connection that took her breath away. Suddenly, she could sense the vast network of life that surrounded them. Every bird soaring overhead, every rabbit hiding in the sage, every snake coiled in the rocks. More than that, she could feel the ancient wisdom that flowed through the land itself, the accumulated memory of countless generations who had walked these trails and drawn sustenance from this harsh but beautiful country. With this gift comes responsibility, Joseph said quietly. You are now a bridge between worlds. Clara Mae, the spirits of my people and the spirits of yours will speak through you when the need arises. Over the following weeks, Joseph began teaching Clara to understand and control her expanding abilities. They met in secret, usually at dawn or dusk when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, in hidden canyons where ancient petroglyphs watched over their lessons like silent guardians. The gift is not about power, Joseph explained during one of their sessions. It is about service. The spirits give us these abilities not to make us greater than others, but to help us serve the greater good. Clara learned to quiet her mind and listen to the subtle voices that spoke through wind and water, through the movement of animals and the patterns of clouds. She discovered that her connection with Rufus was just the beginning. She could communicate with most animals now, though the conversations were more about emotion and intention than actual words. Every creature has its own language, Joseph taught her. The hawk speaks of freedom and perspective. The rabbit knows the secrets of survival and caution. The snake carries wisdom about transformation and healing. You must learn to hear them all, but the most important lesson involved learning to sense danger before it manifested. Clara's abilities were growing stronger each day, and with them came an increasing awareness of threats, both natural and human, that moved through their territory like shadows at the edge of perception. Thought it was during one of these training sessions that Clara first sensed the wrongness that would soon threaten her family's peaceful existence. They were practicing in a secluded canyon where ancient springs fed a small grove of cottonwoods, when Clara suddenly stiffened, her head turning toward the eastern trail like a hunting dog catching a scent. "Men coming," she whispered, though. No dust cloud was visible on the horizon, and no sound of hoofbeats reached their ears. Strangers. They're looking for someone? Joseph nodded approvingly. How many? Clara closed her eyes, extending her consciousness along the invisible threads that connected all living things. 3, maybe 4. They carry anger and purpose, but also fear. They're hunting someone they believe is dangerous. And what do your instincts tell you about their quarry? Clara's blood turned cold as understanding dawned. They're looking for Pa. The next hour passed in tense preparation. Joseph helped Clara gather medicinal herbs and sacred objects, teaching her protective rituals that might shield her family from whatever was coming. But even as they worked, Clara could sense the approaching riders drawing closer, their intentions as sharp and focused as arrowheads. Your father has secrets, Joseph said gently. Secrets that may have finally caught up with him. Are you prepared to stand by him, whatever those secrets might be? Clara thought of her mother's journal, of the kindness that had created debts, spanning generations, of the responsibility that now rested on her young shoulders. He's my pa, she said simply. Whatever he's done, whatever he's running from, that doesn't change. When they returned to the homestead, Clara found Jeremiah pacing nervously in their small yard, his weathered hands checking and rechecking the loads in his old Colt revolver. He looked up as they approached, relief and apprehension warring in his expression. Clara Mae, I need to tell you something, he began, but she held up her hand to stop him. The riders will be here by sunset, she said quietly. They're looking for someone named James Morrison. Jeremiah's face went pale as parchment. How could you possibly know that? "The same way I knew the snake was waiting at the spring," Clara replied. "The spirits speak to those who learn to listen. And they're telling me that my pa isn't really named Clara Mae Cartwright." For a long moment, the only sound was the desert wind sighing through the sage. Then Jeremiah sank onto the wooden step of their porch, his shoulders sagging with the weight of secrets he'd carried for too many years. "James Morrison was my name when I served in the cavalry," he said quietly, "before I learned that some orders aren't worth following and some battles aren't worth fighting." Clara settled beside him, the eagle feather still warm in her hands. Whatever was coming, whatever truths were about to be revealed, she would face them with the courage her mother had shown and the wisdom Joseph had taught her. The spirits had saved her life for a purpose, and she was beginning to understand. That purpose might be larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The wanted poster lay crumpled on Sheriff Morrison's desk like a physical manifestation of past sins coming home to roost. Clara could feel the wrongness radiating from the yellowed paper, even before she read the words that would change everything. She thought she knew about her father. Wanted, James Morrison, formerly Sergeant, 4th Cavalry Regiment. Charge, desertion in the face of the enemy. Reward, $500 dead or alive. Last seen, Fort Apache, Arizona Territory, October 1875. Decrued. Drawing beneath the text showed a younger version of her father's face, clean-shaven and wearing the uniform of the United States Army. But it was the description at the bottom that made Clara's blood run cold. Warning: subject is considered armed and extremely dangerous. May be traveling with stolen military equipment and classified intelligence. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Telegram came in yesterday from the Territorial Marshal's office. Federal bounty hunters picked up James Morrison's trail somewhere near Tucson. They're working their way north, checking every settlement and homestead. Clara's newly awakened abilities allowed her to sense the sheriff's conflict, his genuine affection for the Cartwright family warring with his duty to uphold the law. But there was something else, a deeper current of understanding that suggested Morrison knew more about her father's story than the wanted poster revealed. "Pa's no deserter," Clara said firmly, though even as she spoke the words, pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Her father's nightmares, the way he sometimes stared at the eastern horizon with haunted eyes, his unusual knowledge of military tactics and strategy that seemed at odds with his claim to be a simple farmer. "Child," Sheriff Morrison said gently, "sometimes good men make choices that look bad on paper. Your father, Jeremiah James, whatever name he goes by, is the finest man I've known in these parts. But that doesn't change what the law says about military desertion." Through the sheriff's office window, Clara could see her father talking earnestly with Joseph Crow Feather beside the hitching post. Even at this distance, she could sense the tension radiating from both men, the urgent quality of their conversation. Her enhanced perception picked up fragments of their discussion words like Apache Wars, Massacre, and Witness. "Sheriff Morrison," she said slowly, "what really happened at Fort Apache in 1875? The lawman's face grew grave, and Clara felt his emotional signature shift into something resembling shame. "That's not a story for young ears, Clara Mae." "I'm not as young as I used to be," she replied, unconsciously echoing Joseph's earlier words about children carrying gifts that adults couldn't understand. "And I think I need to know the truth if I'm going to help my pa." Morrison studied her for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words against whatever he saw in her unusual eyes. Finally, he sighed and settled back in his chair. "The official report says that Sergeant James Morrison abandoned his post during a routine patrol operation. But there were rumors, stories that suggested something different had happened. Some said Morrison had discovered evidence of civilian massacres being covered up by his commanding officers. Others claimed he'd been trying to warn Apache families about planned attacks on peaceful villages. Clara felt the truth of it resonating in her bones, confirming what her heart had already known. He didn't desert. He was trying to save people. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, the military doesn't see much difference between desertion and unauthorized contact with enemy forces. Either way, it's a hanging offense. The door to the sheriff's office opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Joseph Crow Feather entered, his weathered face bearing an expression Clara had never seen before, mixture of determination and ancient sadness that spoke of old wounds being reopened. "It is time for the truth," the Apache elder said simply. "Clara Mae has the right to know what debt was truly paid when the snake released her." Sheriff Morrison started to object, but Joseph held up a hand for silence. "James Morrison saved my village, not just from soldiers, but from a sickness that would have killed everyone, men, women, children, elders. He brought medicine stolen from the fort's supplies, along with warning about a planned attack that would have caught us defenseless." Clara's heart hammered in her chest as the full scope of her father's actions became clear. "He risked everything to help your people." "More than risked," Joseph corrected. "He sacrificed everything. His career, his reputation, his identity. After that night, James Morrison could never return to the white world. So he became Clara Mae Cartwright, a man with no past and no future except what he could build with his own hands." "And my mother knew?" "Martha knew," Joseph confirmed. "She was already helping our people when your father arrived in Dead Rock. Their marriage was not just the union of two hearts, but a partnership in service to something greater than themselves." Through the window, Clara could see dust clouds rising on the eastern trail riders approaching at speed. Their horses pushed hard despite the desert heat. Her enhanced senses counted 4 men, all armed, all carrying the grim determination of professional bounty hunters who had finally cornered their quarry. "They're here," she said quietly. Sheriff Morrison stood and checked his gun belt, his face settling into the mask of official duty that Clara knew was costing him dearly. "I'll have to take him into custody, Clara Mae. It's the law." "No," Clara said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "There's another way." She could feel the eagle feather pulsing against her chest, where she tucked it inside her dress, along with the wooden cross that had belonged to her mother. The two objects seemed to be resonating with each other, creating a harmony that spoke of possibilities beyond the simple logic of law and punishment. "The spirit saved me for a reason," Clara continued, her young voice gaining strength and authority. "Not just to live, but to stand between the darkness and those I love. My mother earned protection for her family through kindness. My father earned it through courage and sacrifice. Now it's my turn to pay that debt forward." Joseph Crow Feather's eyes widened with understanding. "You mean to invoke the ancient protections?" "I mean to do whatever needs doing," Clara replied. "Those men coming think they're hunting a deserter, but they're really hunting a hero who chose to save lives instead of follow orders. The spirits know the difference, even if human law doesn't." As the riders drew closer, Clara felt something shifting in the fabric of reality around them. The very air seemed to thicken with possibility, and she could sense invisible watchers gathering spirits of those her parents had helped. Guardians drawn by debt and gratitude and the mysterious forces that sometimes allow justice to transcend the limitations of human institutions. "Whatever happens," she said to Sheriff Morrison, "remember that some stories are bigger than the pieces we can see. My pay may be James Morrison on that wanted poster, but he's also the man who chose mercy over duty, love over law. That has to count for something." Outside, the bounty hunters were reining in their horses, their eyes scanning the settlement with professional assessment. Clara could feel their anticipation, their certainty that they had finally run their quarry to ground. They had no idea that they were about to encounter forces far older and more powerful than territorial law or federal authority. The moment of reckoning was at hand, and Clara Mae Cartwright, daughter of heroes, keeper of ancient gifts, bridge between worlds, was ready to discover exactly what destiny had in mind for a 12-year-old girl who had looked death in the eye and chosen to live. The cavalry saber lay wrapped in oiled cloth beneath Jaramir's bed, hidden like a shameful secret for 5 long years. Clara had never seen it before, but as her father's weathered hands unwrapped the weapon with reverent care, she felt the history radiating from the steel blade years of honorable service. Moments of life and death decision, and finally, the terrible choice that had ended James Morrison's military career and begun Jaramir Cartwright's exile. "I swore I'd never draw this again," her father said quietly, his fingers tracing the worn leather grip. But it seems the past won't let sleeping dogs lie. Through their cabin's single window, Clara could see the bounty hunters dismounting in the town square, their movements deliberate and professional. Her enhanced senses cataloged their weapons, rifles, pistols, knives, and something else that made her spiritual gifts recoil in warning. One of the men carried what looked like a military dispatch case, and Clara could feel malevolent purpose radiating from whatever documents it contained. "They're not just here for the bounty," she said, her voice tight with apprehension. "There's something else, something they want more than money." Joseph Crowfeather appeared in their doorway without knocking, his usually impassive face creased with urgent concern. "My grandson runs fast. He says the men speak of war crimes, of witnesses who must not reach territorial court. They carry papers that claim your father stole more than medicine from Fort Apache." Jaramir's face went pale as understanding dawned. "The report. Sweet Mary, they think I still have the report." "What report?" Clara asked, though her newly awakened intuition was already providing disturbing answers. "Evidence of what really happened at Broken Creek," her father replied, his voice heavy with old pain. "Documentation of orders given, civilians killed, cover-ups orchestrated. I thought it burned with the rest of my gear when I fled the fort, but they believe you kept it," Joseph observed. "Which means the truth threatens someone with enough power to send professional killers this far into the desert." Clara felt the pieces of a larger conspiracy falling into place around them. Her father hadn't just deserted, he'd witnessed something that powerful men needed to keep hidden. The bounty hunters weren't here to collect a simple reward. They were here to eliminate the last witness to crimes that went far beyond military misconduct. "We need help," she said, her mind already racing through possibilities. "More help than just the 3 of us can provide." Joseph nodded grimly. "I sent word to my cousins in the high country. They will come if they can, but it will take time they may not have." "What about the townspeople?" Clara asked. "Sheriff Morrison, Doc Henley, Mrs. Abernathy. They know Pa is a good man." "Against professional killers?" Jaramir shook his head sadly. "I won't ask civilians to die for my mistakes. Maybe it's time I faced what's coming." "No," Clara said with a firmness that surprised them all. "You didn't make mistakes, Pa. You made choices. Hard choices that saved lives and honored what's right over what's legal. There's a difference." She stood and moved to the window, her enhanced perception reaching out to touch the consciousness of every living creature within miles. What she found there filled her with hope and determination. The network of life that surrounded Dead Rock was vast and complex. From the tiniest desert mouse to the great hawks that rode the thermal currents above the mesas. And all of it was connected, all of it capable of serving the ancient purposes that her mother's kindness and her father's courage had set in motion. "I have an idea," she said, turning back to face the 2 men who had become her teachers in very different ways. "But it means trusting in things that can't be seen or proven, things that live in the spaces between worlds." Over the next hour, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, and the bounty hunters made their deliberate inquiries around town, Clara began to weave a plan that relied as much on spiritual intervention as on human cunning. She sent Rufus into the desert with instructions that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand the deep connections between a girl touched by ancient powers and the animals that served as her allies. The old donkey's mission was to gather the desert's creatures in patterns that would confuse and misdirect the hunters, creating false trails and phantom sightings that would scatter their attention across miles of wasteland. Clara's consciousness rode with Rufus as he communicated her intentions to coyote packs, roadrunner families, and the vast community of smaller creatures whose movements could suggest human passage to trackers who knew how to read such signs. Meanwhile, Joseph Crowfeather prepared sacred objects and spoke words in the old language that seemed to thicken the air with invisible presence. He arranged stones in patterns that meant protection to his people, burned herbs that carried prayers to the spirit world, and painted symbols on their cabin walls that would mark it as a place under the guardianship of forces older than territorial law. "Your mother's journal," he said to Clara as he worked. "The spirits say it contains something important, something that connects her work to your father's sacrifice." Clara retrieved the hidden volume and opened it to pages she hadn't read before. Entries from the final weeks of Martha's life, when fever had made her writing nearly illegible. But there, buried in the rambling observations of a dying woman, she found what Joseph's spirits had guided her to discover. July 3, 1879. She read aloud. "James showed me the papers today, the ones he carried from Fort Apache. The report of what Colonel Hardwick ordered at Broken Creek is more terrible than I imagined. 47 Apache families, mostly women and children, killed under a flag of truce. The soldiers were told it was a legitimate military action, but James saw the aftermath. He knows it was murder. He says the territorial governor was involved, maybe even officials in Washington. That's why he can never go back. That's why we can never be truly safe. But also why the truth must be preserved," Joseph added. "Your mother hid those papers somewhere, didn't she?" Clara closed her eyes and let her enhanced intuition guide her consciousness through the spaces of their small homestead, and there, in a place she would never have thought to look without spiritual guidance, she felt the presence of documents that radiated importance and danger in equal measure. "The root cellar," she whispered. "Under the false bottom pava built to hide our emergency supplies." They found the papers exactly where Clara's abilities had indicated, a collection of military reports, personal correspondence, and detailed accounts that painted a picture of systematic genocide disguised as frontier warfare. The evidence was damning enough to destroy careers and possibly topple the territorial government, which explained why men with kill orders were willing to chase one cavalry deserter across hundreds of miles of desert. "Now what?" Jeremiah asked, staring at the documents that had defined his exile. "Even if we survive the next few hours, these papers ensure that I'll never be safe anywhere in the territories. Unless," Clara said slowly, "we find a way to make the truth stronger than the lies." As the afternoon wore on, Clara felt her plan taking shape with the inevitability of a desert storm building on the horizon. The bounty hunters were growing impatient, their careful inquiries becoming more aggressive. As townspeople closed ranks around the Cartwright family, Sheriff Morrison was walking a careful line between official cooperation and deliberate obstruction, while Doc Henley and Mrs. Abernathy spread subtle warnings that allowed key families to quietly prepare for trouble. But Clara knew that human allies, however brave and loyal, would not be enough to face professional killers backed by territorial authority. What she needed was something that transcended human law entirely, the ancient justice that flowed through the land itself, the accumulated power of debt and gratitude and spiritual protection that her family had earned through years of selfless service. As the sun began its descent toward the western mesas, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Clara felt the invisible watchers gathering around Dead Rock like storm clouds, heavy with rain. The spirits of Apache children saved by her mother's medicine. The grateful ghosts of families warned by her father's courage. The ancient powers that govern the balance between justice and mercy. All of them were converging on this remote settlement where a 12-year-old girl with extraordinary gifts was about to discover exactly how far courage and faith could carry her in a world that measured justice by different standards than those written in territorial law books. The bounty hunters were making their final preparations, checking weapons and discussing approach strategies in voices that carried clearly to Clara's enhanced hearing. Their leader, a hard-faced man with military bearing, was studying a hand-drawn map of the Cartwright homestead while his companions examined ammunition and discussed fields of fire like soldiers planning an assault. "They mean to take us at sunset," Clara told her father and Joseph, "when the light is behind them and visibility works in their favor. But they don't understand what they're really facing." She could feel the desert's creatures moving into position around their homestead, not with the random patterns of wildlife going about normal business, but with the purposeful coordination of an army responding to a general's commands. Coyotes took positions that would allow them to strike at the hunters' horses. Hawks circled overhead, ready to dive at faces and hands at the moment of greatest confusion. Even the smallest creatures had roles to play, from the mice that would gnaw through leather straps to the lizards that would create distractions at crucial moments. "The old powers are waking," Joseph observed, his weathered face filled with wonder and apprehension. "I have not felt such gathering of spiritual force since my grandfather's time, when the spirits still walked openly among the people." Clara nodded, feeling the truth of his words in her bones. She was no longer just a girl with unusual gifts. She had become a focal point for forces that transcended the ordinary world, a bridge between the visible and invisible realms that governed life and death in the desert. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the sense of rightness that came with accepting her true destiny. As the sun touched the rim of the western hills, Clara took her position on the front porch of their cabin, the eagle feather in one hand and her mother's wooden cross in the other. Behind her, Jeremiah held his cavalry saber with the steady grip of a man who had made peace with whatever fate awaited him. Joseph Crow Feather stood at her side, his medicine bundle open and ready, his lips moving in silent prayers that seemed to bend the very air around them. The bounty hunters emerged from the town like dark spirits rising from the earth. There, weapons gleaming in the dying light. They moved with professional precision, but Clara could sense their unease at the unnatural silence that had fallen over Dead Rock. No dogs barked. No children played in the streets. No normal sounds of frontier. Evening carried on the desert wind. It was as if the entire settlement was holding its breath, waiting for forces beyond human understanding to reveal their intentions. "James Morrison," the lead hunter called out when they were still 50 yards away. "By order of the Territorial. Marshal, you're under arrest for desertion and theft of military property. Come out with your hands visible, and no one needs to get hurt." Clara felt her father's impulse to respond, to step forward and face whatever judgment awaited him. But she also felt the deeper currents of destiny flowing around them, the sense that this moment was about far more than one man's past mistakes or the bounty hunter's immediate mission. "Wait," she whispered, her enhanced perception detecting movement in the gathering darkness. "They're not alone." Her spiritual gifts revealed what her eyes could not see, additional figures moving through the desert beyond the settlement, approaching with the stealth and coordination of Apache warriors who had learned to move like shadows across their ancestral lands. Joseph's message to his relatives had been received, and now the network of debt and gratitude that connected Clara's family to the native peoples was about to manifest in ways that would test every assumption about justice, law, and the true meaning of protection. The Thunderstones had been waiting in Joseph Crowfeather's medicine bundle for 3 generations, passed down from grandfather to grandson along with the knowledge of when and how to use them. Now, as Clara held the ancient objects in her small hands, she could feel the accumulated power of storms captured in crystalline form, energy that could call lightning from clear skies or still the wind with a whispered prayer. When the moment comes, Joseph instructed quietly, speak to them as your grandmother's grandmother spoke to the spirits that dwell in the high places. They will hear you, child. They have been waiting to hear you. The bounty hunters had spread into a semicircle around the Cartwright homestead, their rifles trained on the small cabin where 3 figures stood in defiant silhouette against the dying light. Their leader, a man called Briggs, who wore his military bearing like armor, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never encountered resistance that couldn't be overcome with superior firepower. This is your last warning, Morrison, he called out. Surrender now, or face the consequences. Clara felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, all the forces they had gathered hovering between action and restraint. The desert creatures were in position. Joseph's relatives were moving through the darkness beyond the settlement, and the spirits of those her parents had helped seemed to press close around them like an invisible army waiting for the word to charge. But it was the human allies who moved first. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the shadows between buildings, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight as he walked with measured steps toward the confrontation. Behind him came Doc Henley, Mrs. Abernathy, and a dozen other townspeople, all carrying rifles or shotguns, all wearing expressions of grim determination. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Sheriff Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of local law. James Morrison isn't here. Hasn't been here for years, according to my records. Briggs turned to face this unexpected challenge, his professional composure showing the first cracks of uncertainty. Don't interfere with federal business, Sheriff. We have jurisdiction here. Do you now? Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward, her usual storekeeping efficiency replaced by steel-edged defiance. Because as far as I can tell, you boys are trespassing on private property with intent to commit violence against a peaceful family. That's what we call a hanging offense in these parts. Clara watched the scene unfold with growing amazement. These people, her neighbors, her father's friends, the community that had quietly embraced the Cartwright family, despite their mysterious past, were risking everything to stand between her family and the guns of professional killers. But she could also sense the terrible danger of the moment. The bounty hunters were outnumbered but better armed. Trained killers facing shopkeepers and farmers who had never experienced real warfare. That was when the Bay's Apache warriors revealed themselves. They emerged from the desert like ghosts taking solid form, dozens of figures materializing from rocks and shadows where none had been visible moments before. They moved without sound, their presence announced only by the subtle shift in the air that made even the bounty hunters' horses begin to sidestep nervously. Joseph Crowfeather's nephew, a young man called Running Wolf, stepped into the circle, a firelight that marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. He spoke in the old language, his words carrying across the desert air like music, and Clara felt her newly awakened gifts translating the meaning directly into her consciousness. The white soldiers seek one who saved our children, Running Wolf said in English, his voice pitched to carry to every listener. They call him deserter, we call him hero. The spirits have spoken. This man walks under our protection. Briggs raised his rifle with practiced speed, but Clara had already sensed his intention. The thunderstones pulsed in her hands, and she felt the ancient power flowing through her small frame like liquid lightning. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from the stones themselves, from the earth beneath their feet, from the vast sky above their heads. Stop. The single word hit the assembled men like a physical force. Rifles lowered involuntarily. Horses ceased their nervous movements, and even the desert winds seemed to pause in its eternal whisper through the sage. Clara felt the attention of every living thing focused on her small figure standing on the cabin porch, the eagle feather in one hand and the thunderstones glowing softly in the other. "You came here hunting a man you call criminal," she said, her young voice somehow carrying the weight of ancient authority. "But the spirits know truth from lies, justice from vengeance. James Morrison chose conscience over orders, mercy over duty. The blood of innocence is not on his hands. It is on the hands of those who sent you." Briggs struggled to raise his weapon again, confusion and fear warring across his weathered features. "You're just a child. You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand that some debts can only be paid with courage," Clara replied, "and some protection comes from places your laws don't recognize." The thunderstones pulsed brighter, and Clara felt the moment of decision approaching like a storm front racing across the desert, the point where all the gathered forces would either find resolution or explode into violence that would leave the desert sand soaked with blood. The peace pipe that Joseph Crowfeather drew from his medicine bundle was older than memory, carved from sacred stone by ancestors whose names had been forgotten, but whose wisdom lived on in the ceremonies they had created. As he filled the bowl with tobacco and sage, the sweet smoke that rose from the ancient stem seemed to carry the accumulated prayers of generations, requests for wisdom, pleas for peace, offerings of gratitude to the spirits that watched over all living things. Clara felt the power shift as Joseph lit the pipe with a coal from their small fire. The thunderstones in her hands responded to the sacred smoke, their glow softening, from lightning white to the warm gold of dawn breaking over the desert. Around them, the tension that had stretched like a bowstring between opposing forces began to transform into something else, not surrender, but understanding. "In the old ways," Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly across the space between cabin and desert, "truth was settled not by the strongest arm or the fastest gun, but by the willingness to speak honestly before the spirits that see all things. If these men truly serve justice, let them accept the pipe and speak their real purpose here." Briggs laughed harshly, but Clara could sense the uncertainty beneath his bravado. "Savage rituals don't mean anything to federal law, old man. We have our orders." "Orders from men who were not here when the choices were made," Running Wolf replied, with quiet dignity. "Orders that do not account for the true cost of what happened at Broken Creek." Clara felt the moment crystallizing around that name, Broken Creek. The massacre that had turned her father from soldier to exile, the atrocity that powerful men needed to keep hidden at any cost. She closed her eyes and let her enhanced consciousness reach out to touch the memories that still lingered in the desert, air like ghosts too stubborn to rest. What she found there made her gasp with horror and recognition. She saw it all through her father's eyes. The Apache families camped peacefully by the creek, white flags of truce fluttering in the morning breeze. Women and children gathering water for breakfast while their men sat in council with army representatives. She felt his growing unease as Colonel Hardwick's true intentions became clear, saw him realize that the meeting was not about peace but about eliminating witnesses to earlier crimes, and she experienced his desperate choice: obey orders and participate in mass murder, or break his oath and try to save innocent lives. 47 people died at Broken Creek, Clara said, her voice carrying the weight of witnessed truth. Families who came to make peace, who trusted that white flags meant safety. My father tried to stop it. When he couldn't, he chose to warn others rather than let the killing continue. "You don't know what you're talking about," Briggs snarled. But Clara could feel his certainty cracking like ice in spring sunshine. "I know because the spirits remember," Clara replied. "The dead speak to those who learn to listen. They say the real criminals were never punished, never even charged. They say you're not here for justice, you're here to protect murderers." She opened her eyes and focused her enhanced perception on the bounty hunters. reading the truth in their emotional signatures with the clarity that only spiritual gifts could provide. What she found there confirmed her worst suspicions. "You know he's innocent," she said to Briggs. "You've always known. Just like you know that Colonel Hardwick and his supporters can't afford to have a witness testify before a territorial court. That's why you carry kill orders instead of arrest warrants." The lead bounty hunter's hand moved toward his gun, but Joseph's relatives were already in motion, their traditional weapons suddenly visible in the firelight. The townspeople tightened their own formation, and Clara felt the desert creatures gathering closer, sensing that the moment of decision had finally arrived. But it was the spirits themselves who ended the standoff. The peace pipe in Joseph's hands began to glow with the same soft radiance that emanated from Clara's thunderstones. The sacred smoke rose in patterns that defied the evening breeze, forming shapes that looked almost like human figures, transparent beings that stood between the opposing forces with hands raised in blessing and warning. Clara felt her mother's presence among them, along with the Apache families her father had tried to save, the children her parents had healed and helped over the years, and countless others whose lives had been touched by acts of courage and kindness. They formed a circle of protection around the homestead, visible to anyone with eyes to see beyond the merely physical world. "The debt is paid," Joseph announced, his voice resonating with ceremonial authority. "The protection is sealed. Those who would harm the innocent under color of law must face the judgment of powers greater than territorial government." Briggs stared at the glowing figures with fear replacing his professional composure. His companions were backing away involuntarily, their weapons forgotten as they confronted something that their training had never prepared them to face. "This isn't over," Briggs said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," Clara replied with quiet certainty, "it is." The spirits faded slowly, leaving only the memory of their presence and the knowledge that some protections ran deeper than human law could reach. In the growing darkness, Clara felt the thunderstones cooling in her hands, their power spent, but their purpose fulfilled. Justice had been served, not the kind written in law books, but the older justice that flows from the balance between mercy and truth, courage and consequence. The real battle was over. Now came the harder task of learning to live with the victory. 6 months after the night when spirits walked openly in Dead Rock, Clara Mae Cartwright stood in the same spot beside the spring where a rattlesnake had changed the course of her life forever. But now she was no longer the frightened child who had thrown herself between death and the creature she loved. The wooden cross that hung around her neck was new, carved by her father's careful hands to replace the one her mother had worn. But it carried the same weight of faith and the same promise of protection. The desert had bloomed that spring with unusual abundance, as if the spiritual forces that had converged on their small settlement had blessed the land itself with renewed life. Wildflowers painted the red rock landscape in brilliant yellows and purples, while the cottonwoods by the spring had grown thicker and more vibrant than anyone could remember. Even the water ran clearer and stronger, as though ancient springs had been opened by powers that understood the connection between spiritual renewal and physical abundance. Rufus stood beside her, his gray coat gleaming with health and his dark eyes holding the wisdom of a creature who had shared in miraculous events. The old donkey had become something of a celebrity among the neighboring settlements, with travelers coming from miles away just to see the animal that had survived a diamondback strike and somehow retained his bond with the girl who spoke to spirits. But Rufus bore the attention with patient dignity, secure in his role as Clara's partner in whatever adventures lay ahead. "Hard to believe how much has changed," Jeremiah said, settling onto a fallen log with the satisfied exhaustion of a man who had finally found peace with his past. The federal investigation that followed the bounty hunters' return to Tucson had resulted in Colonel Hardwick's arrest and the territorial governor's resignation. The documents Martha had hidden had found their way to investigators with the integrity to pursue justice regardless of political consequences, and James Morrison had been officially exonerated of all charges, but more than legal vindication. Her father had found something he'd lost years ago, the ability to sleep without nightmares, to speak his real name without fear, to plan for a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Doc Henley says you've been helping Mrs. Patterson with a difficult pregnancy, Jeremiah continued, pride evident in his voice. Says you knew the baby was coming early before she even felt the first pain. Clara nodded, her enhanced perception automatically monitoring the life signs of every creature within miles. The gift keeps growing stronger. Sometimes I wonder if it will ever stop. Would you want it to? She considered the question seriously, as she had learned to consider all questions about her unusual abilities. The power that flowed through her was both blessing and burden, opening doors to understanding she'd never imagined, while also setting her apart from the normal world in ways that sometimes felt isolating. No, she said finally. I wouldn't want it to stop, but I hope I can learn to use it wisely. Joseph Crowfeather emerged from the cluster of cottonwoods, his weathered face bearing the serene expression of a man who had witnessed the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. In the months since the confrontation with the bounty hunters, he had become Clara's primary teacher in the arts of spiritual healing and communication with the natural world. Under his guidance, she had learned to channel her gifts more precisely, helping with difficult births, locating lost livestock, and providing early warning of the storms and droughts that could devastate frontier communities. The tribal council met yesterday, he announced, settling beside them with the careful movements of advancing age. They have decided to formally adopt the Cartwright family into the Windwalker clan. It is a great honor, and one that carries certain responsibilities. Clara felt the weight of those responsibilities settling around her, like the ceremonial blanket that would mark her new status. She was being asked to serve as an official bridge between two worlds, a living embodiment of the cooperation that could exist between peoples if mutual respect and understanding replaced fear and prejudice. Will I have to live with your people? She asked, though she already knew the answer through the subtle spiritual connections that linked her to Joseph's consciousness. You will live where you are needed most, he replied. Sometimes that will be here, among the white settlers who have learned to trust your gift. Sometimes it will be with my people, who see in you the fulfillment of old promises. But always, you will belong to both worlds and neither, walking the spaces between them with feet that know the path to peace. As the sun began its descent toward the western mesas, painting the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been just another frontier child, struggling to survive in harsh country. Now she was something unprecedented, a healer whose gifts transcended racial boundaries, a peacemaker whose authority came from sources older than territorial law. A young woman whose destiny was inextricably linked to the ancient balance between civilization and wilderness. The townspeople of Dead Rock had adjusted to her unique status with the pragmatic acceptance that frontier life demanded. When someone needed help that conventional methods couldn't provide, they came to Clara. When disputes arose that threatened the fragile peace between communities, they asked for her mediation. She had become their unofficial guardian, the spiritual protector, whose gifts ensured that Dead Rock would always be a place where different peoples could coexist in harmony. I miss her sometimes, Clara said quietly, touching the wooden cross at her throat. Mama, I mean. I wonder what she'd think of all this. She knows, Jeremiah replied with absolute certainty. Wherever she is, whatever comes after this life, she knows that her kindness planted seeds that grew into something beautiful. She knows that her daughter became everything she hoped for and more. Clara smiled, feeling the truth of his words and the warm pulse of the cross against her skin. As they made their way back toward home, she walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the great web of existence. Behind them, the spring continued its eternal flow, and around them, the desert prepared for another night of mysteries and wonders that only those with eyes to see could fully appreciate. She was exactly where she belonged.